Bio 30. Welcome to our last chapter in our course, chapter 20, where we're calculating population changes with four equations that we'll look at, and look at some other ways that populations are categorized and analyzed. And here we go. So we have these four formulas that are on the cover of your notes that we will be working with. One is population density. Second one is how the population changes. Third one is about growth rate. And fourth one is per capita growth rate. And so have your calculators ready to work on those. Some definitions that generally you'll find familiar. Population being all the individuals in a species at a certain time and certain place. That is a population of organisms. A community is all of the species in an area at one time. And ecosystem includes all of those species in the community and the abiotic factors around them, meaning non-living things like water and climate and soil and wind and all of those things. Habitat, where they live. Niche, their function or role in the community. The range is where they would be found on the globe. And biosphere is everywhere living organisms are found on Earth, including the air, land, and water that has organisms in it. Okay, so first formula, population density, is simply the number over area. So if we are talking on land, we would use number over area, number of organisms in the area. If we're looking at an aquatic ecosystem, it would be the number of organisms in the certain volume of water. So the area often is in meters squared, could be kilometers squared though, could even be centimeters squared, cubic centimeters if it is measured that way in water. So if you'd like to calculate how many, what the population density is of this bison question here, remember, always a good idea to write your formula first and fill that in. 200 bison is the number over the 10 square kilometers, and there you have your answer, 20 bison per square kilometer. There you go, pretty simple. We're going to throw in here our patterns of population distribution, and that would be looking at the way the organisms are found in that area. So they are either randomly found in the area, so they might be clumping together where there's water or food, or they just run in a pack. And they will be found randomly everywhere. Clump distribution would be where they are in, let's rewind here. Sorry. So random would be where they do not have to compete, so they are rarely found randomly because they are usually found clumped in a herd or a pack and where there is certain food, water, or shelter. So, right, random is all over the place. Clumped is where they find food or shelter. Uniform distribution would be where someone maybe planted a garden like so, or it could be something that's territorial. And so if it's territorial, there would be a big area where there would just be one, and another big area where there'd be just one more. So there would be reasons that they would be uniform. So looking at some examples here that were in your book, uniform distribution would be the territorial eagles. Random distribution might be the moose that just wanders around. And then the yucca plant would be one that is clumped where found in patches because of them growing where their sprouts, their rhizomes are in underground. Okay, so if you saw a representation of that, here uniform might look like this indication in A, and random would be just kind of all over the place, more in some areas and less in others, and clumped would be in very obvious clumps that they have the resources that they need. Okay, so second formula we're going to deal with is the change in population size. The change takes into account the births, also called natality. It takes into account the deaths, the mortality. It takes into account immigration, how many move in, and emigration, how many move out. Now, births and immigration add to the population, and deaths and emigration take away from that population. So our formula to find out the change in the population size would have to be the factors that make it go up, subtracting the factors that make it go down. So that would be the births and the immigration minus the deaths and emigration. So B plus I minus D plus E. Now on your data sheet, you will see this, factors that make it go up minus factors that make it go down. What you have to remember is that's B plus I minus D plus E, births and immigration, which make it go up, subtract the deaths plus emigration that make it go down. Okay? Now, growth rate, number 3, often needs the change in population size for that calculation. So you may have to do the B plus I minus D plus E and use that in your calculation of growth rate, because the change in number, sometimes they only know births minus deaths, but sometimes they give you all 4 parts of that equation. You put it into this equation and divide it by the change in time. So final minus initial for the time. So in this example, with the bison, 2,000 bison in 2002 and 3,200 bison in 2008, you only have the final minus initial bison count. So you don't have all 4 parts of that previous equation for this. So you just subtract the change in number and put it over the change in time, which is 6 years. And in this case, your answer works out to be 200 for the growth rate. That one's pretty simple. Okay. Some of the questions you have will involve the B plus I minus D plus E to use for the change in number. And the same goes for the per capita growth rate. And for the per capita growth rate, which is number 3, I believe, the per capita growth rate, CGR, is the change in those number of individuals compared to the original number it had. So it's just another way to look at the population change, because you're comparing it to how many there used to be. So again, for change in number, you may have to do B plus I minus D plus E, death plus births and immigration minus deaths plus emigration. Or they might just say final minus initial. There used to be this many and now there's this many. You subtract that by the original number. So your CGR could be the final minus initial population, or it could be the change in population calculated with all 4 factors. And that's always over the initial number that you had in the question. So here's a simple one, CGR of wood bison using the previous information of final minus initial being 1,200 that we calculated as our change in number before, divided by the 2,000 of the original number, so it's 1,200 over the original number of 2,000. This was the change in population. This was the original amount of the number of bison. And you notice that CGR has no unit. So CGR is simply 0.6, and that's the answer for CGR, per capita growth rate. Okay, we're going to, strangely, that was actually number 4. That was all the formulas, actually. And so we've got some practice for that coming up. And a couple last things here. Biotic potential, this term means basically how many offspring species can have. And it could be what the max, including all of these factors, the maximum number of babies they have, how many survive to reproduce on their own, how often they have babies, how old they are before they're mature and can reproduce, and their lifespan. So those will give you a, those factors determine whether it's a high or low biotic potential. So generally, if they're small, simpler organisms, they tend to have a higher biotic potential, like insects, or even this starfish, which sometimes aren't so small, but they have a high biotic potential because they can lay over 1 million eggs in a year. Also, when they have a their reproductive circumstance is also called their fecundity, if you ever come across that word. Their high biotic potential can be called fecundity. Okay, so something like large mammals then would have a low biotic potential because of how it takes many years before they are mature and can reproduce. Okay, to finish up this topic, we'll talk about growth patterns. And the growth patterns here, you may have seen the introduction to this topic with 2 different growth patterns that were looked at for I think it was a bison and an insect. And when you see this exponential growth pattern here, which means that the number of organisms is rising sharply, they call this the J-shaped growth pattern. And it says it will go and grow exponentially. And sometimes there's a sharp death phase. If it's like bacteria in a petri dish, they may exponentially grow and then crash, so they may call that a boom and bust. Sometimes that can happen because they've depleted their resources and used up all their food, and wastes have accumulated. So the regular 4 parts of a growth curve, there might be a lag as a population is introduced to a new area, and so they don't have many births, but then they have a growth phase. So births will be pretty high as they're actively reproducing. Then they may reach a carrying capacity where the environment can only have resources for so many, and basically births equal the deaths, so it kind of levels out. And then if they don't get any more food in the area and they've reused up all the resources, there might be a decline in that population. So those 4 parts you should know about a population as it changes over time. Okay, exponential growth. This might be found in confined populations like a petri dish, and food and waste end up being limiting factors if it's in a closed population like a petri dish. And those organisms may have this J-shaped growth, but eventually they may also die out if they don't get any fresh resources. So in terms of the J-shaped growth pattern, and remember this is as time goes on, this is the number of organisms. Often these happen to little creatures like insects that have a high reproductive rate. So this is called a J-shaped graph. It is showing exponential growth, and it's often to these little creatures that have a high reproductive rate, and we call those R selected species. So R just means high reproductive rate. And so you need to know those 3 things about a graph like this. that it's a J shape, it shows exponential growth, and our selected species typically have that type of growth pattern. And those R selected species are ones that can be found where there's an unstable environment and they can adapt. They have a short lifespan like insects or dandelions. They have an unstable population size, usually really small, reproduce once, have lots of babies, short reproductive cycles, don't need parental care, and this boom and bust or J-shaped graph is typical of them. Okay, and so if they say boom and bust, that means that not only can they rapidly reproduce exponentially, but they often bust after that and die off, like dandelions do or insects do in the fall. So microorganisms, insects, and annual plants like dandelions, those are examples of our selected species. Okay, so the second kind of graph, there's just the two of them, is the logistic or S-shaped pattern. And this one is going to take time to get going. So it's going to be not as exponentially going up as quickly. It's going to level off, and you're going to see this as a time when it reaches carrying capacity. And so the carrying capacity is reached because of things that will keep it at a constant size, like predators, weather, disease, loss of habitat, or excess population that the environment can't hold. So the ones that show this are ones that are often open and free-moving populations, in that will have some births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. They are often a little bit larger organisms, and because they reach carrying capacity, they are considered a K-selected species. So you see them take time to get established, then they slowly get higher in number, but then they reach carrying capacity. And these organisms are found in environments that are fairly stable. They have a longer life, stable population size, larger body size, breed selectively, and have few babies, long reproductive cycles, so they take time to carry their young. It takes longer, they have long parental care, take care of their babies for a longer time, and they will be the ones with this S-shaped population growth pattern. So they'll take time to get established, they'll go up in number, but reach carrying capacity. So that is why it's considered an S shape, and this is typical of those K-selected species that will reach carrying capacity. So the K sound, carrying capacity, gives you a clue that is those guys. And this shape, it's not exponential, it's called logistic. It's a logistic growth pattern because it takes time to get established. And so humans are part of that K-selected group, so are other large animals, and all those animals kind of in the in-between size may have some features of both K and R, because this is a continuum. So on the far side, we've got the insects with the high reproductive, the R-selected species. On the other end of the continuum, the K-selected species, like these large animals, but there's many in between that may have some characteristics of both. Okay, this brings us back to the launch lab that I wanted to wait until we got to this point to address again, because you can think about the mosquito and the three things we learned about the graph of the mosquito going from in the 60 days, which is 2 month time, going from 0 to 10,000 mosquitoes. We can see that this is an exponential growth pattern. This is mosquitoes who are selected, and we can say that this is always going to be that the shape that would be called a J-shaped graph. For this one over with the bison, it took them a little time to get going here, but eventually they are growing in number, but then they kind of level out at the whatever, around 950 number of bison over these years. So we consider this one a logistic growth pattern. These are K-selected species, these bison, that reach carrying capacity. And so this would be an S-shaped graph. So that is kind of compiling, reviewing those main concepts about graph shapes. And so when you review these, again, this would be the J, and this would be exponential, representing our selected species. This would be the S shape, and logistic, representing the K-selected species. Okay, last little bit, limiting factors can be density dependent or density independent, and basically things that are density dependent are biotic factors, living things. So living things like diseases, bacteria, viruses, predators, those will affect populations if they're more dense. So we can think of viruses that can spread through densely populated areas more quickly. So density dependent factors are always living factors. Density independent factors are abiotic factors that will get everybody no matter if they're dense or not. So density independent, abiotic, like the rain storm that will fall no matter it's dense or not, or the fire that will whip through the forest, whether it's got a few trees or densely packed. So these abiotic factors like the sun, the precipitation, natural disasters do not change because of the density. So density dependent, biotic things; density independent, abiotic things. And environmental resistance would be things like the factors that will resist the growth, the major growth of the population. So that could be how many resources there are, how much competition there is, whether it's intraspecific competition of wolf versus wolf going for the same food, or interspecific competition, different species going for the same food. That's interspecies competition. Predators, disease, climate change, those environmental resistance factors will also affect population size, as you see in this picture. So things like how much oxygen, food, diseases, predators, or space will keep our carrying capacity at a certain level. So that's why it levels out at some point, in particular for those K-selected species. These answers here are the page 10 and 11 answers, and you guys can do your practice and make sure your calculator is going and practicing some of those